Today we'll be working in my workbook called Open the Curtain into the Psalms, which covers Psalms 22 to 31. Normally, if this was the first Psalm of the book, I would be going over this in detail. But since this isn't the first Psalm in the book, then you can stop the video and read this if you'd like. This talks about the general study on Psalms, separating the Psalm into groups, musical nature of the Psalms, and the poetic features of the Psalms that we'll see in this book. Now we're going to do Psalm um, Psalm 23, one of the most favorite Psalms everybody loves. In fact, even though I do want my books in NIV, I actually had to change this one to fit the one that I have already memorized in my heart, because otherwise it gets too complicated, right? So here I go. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And that's a Psalm of David, by the way. And oh, by the way, I didn't mention it yet in the first Psalm, but the Lord is my shepherd. The title is not really the title. These Psalms were made without titles, but the New King James added titles, and I thought that was very appropriate. It's easier in the table of contents to actually have an idea of what the story is about. So I've included those, even though they're not part of the psalm, the original psalm. Anyway, here's some comments, and like I have mentioned in the other psalm studies, there's 150 psalms. There's at least that many different types of commentators with different ideas on the psalms. The psalms have so much variety in it, so much ways you can decipher them. It's both scary and exciting for a Bible researcher to try to figure out how to explain what they see. And so that I've only selected a number of commentators that kind of talked about the same thing most people do, and then I've also looked at chronology because I've really wanted to kind of get a feel of where these might have been written, what time of year, time of history that these might have been written. So the Psalm is part of the first book of Psalms. There are 5 books of Psalms. The NIV Study Bible states that Psalm 23 illustrates David trusting in the Lord as a shepherd king. It is the most widely known of the Psalms. Indeed, according to Jamieson, Fausset, and Brown, Psalm 23 is classified as a praise psalm. Historically, since David doesn't specifically tell us when it was written, Bible scholars tend to disagree. The Blue Letter Bible believes it was written towards the end of David's life, whereas others believe it was right after he slew Goliath. I believe, since it's such a positive psalm, it would have to be during David's prime of life or after he slew Goliath. The only heading that was given with this psalm was that it was a psalm of David. Although the word that translates to of could mean about and not by, this could mean that someone else wrote it about David rather than him writing it. However, in this case, it fits well that David wrote it. The psalm divides into 3 sections. First section is the Lord as a shepherd who sustains and leads, verses 1 through 3. The second section is the Lord as a shepherd who protects, verse 4. And the last section is the Lord as a host, verses 5 and 6. So questions about Psalm 23. The first section, the Lord as a shepherd who sustains and leads, and verses 1 through 3. David uses the concept of metaphor to beautifully illustrate his concept about the Messiah being the good shepherd. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. I guess I must have learned it from the King James Version because I keep going back to leadeth and thy. Also, like a shepherd with sheep, David is not choosing his path, but the Messiah is. He, let's see, lie down. Where Psalms 1 through 3. He makes me to lie down. He leads me beside still waters. He leads me in the path of righteousness. This psalm is written in the first person point of view. Notice all the my, me, and I of the whole psalm. How many are there? My goodness, I have to put this back to see that. Okay. I, me, how many my's? One in verse 1. 2, and 1 in verse 3. One my in verse 5. 2 my's in verse 5. One my in verse 6. So I see 5 and 6 verses of my, me. Let's see, 1 in verse 2, 2 in verse 2, 3 in verse 1 in verse 3, 1 in verse 4, 2 in verse 4, 1 in verse 5. I think there were more my's than I picked up before too. 1 in verse 6. So there's about 7 me's. And then I's, 1 in verse 1, 1 in verse 4, 2 in verse 4, and 1 in verse 6. So that's 4 I's. I'll move this back now. In verse 3, we seem to have a reason why Jesus leads and sustains like a shepherd. What seems to be the reason? For his name's sake. Jesus as a shepherd guides the sheep on the correct paths, not just for the sheep's benefit, but to protect the reputation of the shepherd, who is responsible for the flock. David's protection is an example to others what protection they will receive when they're under the care of the Good Shepherd. In John 10 below, Jesus elaborates about being the Good Shepherd to his flock. What does Jesus do for us as his sheep? John 10, 2 through 5, 7, 11. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Very truly, I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He follows and he leads them in proper ways. He gives them life and he lays down his life for his sheep. The second section is the Lord as a shepherd protects, verse 4. Again, David is using vivid imagery to illustrate his thought. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. What is the connection to a shepherd in verse 4? The rod and staff. The shepherd uses, move this over a little bit, uses a rod for protection and discipline and a staff for guidance and rescue. The rod is a short, heavy club used to defend the flock from predators, to count sheep, or to use discipline, or to discipline a straying animal. The staff is a long pole, often with a hook, to gently guide sheep, lift them out of trouble, and pull them closer. What are the 2 reasons listed in verse 4 that David will not fear what evil will do? Let's move this over so that helps. What are the 2 reasons? That Jesus is with him and they comfort him. The second section is the Lord as host. So that's verses 5 through 6. So we'll move this back. Oops, not that way. Back. And then we want that way. Okay, verses 5 and 6. Now David changes the scene completely to that of a king's banquet with the Lord as the host. Although he had occasionally visited King Saul before to play for him, in reality, David himself goes from shepherd one day to being in the king's house the next, due to his slaying of Goliath the Philistine. However, King Saul becomes jealous of him. Looking at the scripture below, if there was feasting, who would be the enemies at the table? 1 Samuel 18, 6 through 9. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This phrase displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. And Saul and his loyal members would be the enemies at the table. Was David anointed? 1 Samuel 16:13. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. So yes, he was anointed. David was also anointed later as king. 2 Samuel 5:3. When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed King David king over Israel. Another good reason why I believe that David wrote this soon after slowing Goliath is verse 6. In verse 6, in the past tense, current tense, or future tense? Future tense. Since he is looking toward the future, he doesn't see himself at the end of his life. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Many Bible scholars have a problem with this verse since the temple has not yet been built. However, the tabernacle still exists, or he would be expressing a desire to live in God's constant presence rather than a literal physical building. What part of the psalm touches your heart the most? A lot of time, well, sometimes it's other parts, but I guess 4 right now. And because I know someone who's having that happen right through, and I've been telling them, don't worry, God is with you. God is with you. And so I can really get into verse 4. Now the psalm moves on. How it does. Even though this is the most memorized of the psalm, it is actually not quoted elsewhere in the Bible, which is interesting to me. The Jews use Psalm 23 for a variety of religious and cultural purposes, including singing it during the third meal of the Sabbath, reciting it during funerals and in the presence of the deceased, and using its themes of guidance and provision in the context of the temple pilgrimages and daily prayer. There are several kids' songs that derive from Psalm 23. Keith Green, Leanna Crawford, and Don Moen, among many others, have made songs on this psalm. And that's the end of this this video on Psalm 23. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you now. Bye.